The Chinese believe that it is their right and their destiny to rise up.
Are we entering a new era of great power competition?
If you take the new president, he says Taiwan is already an independent state. I think that's delusional.
In this exclusive interview, we sit down with Professor Graham Allison in Beijing to explore the dynamics shaping the US-China relationship and the potential for cooperation amid rising tensions.
And in that situation, a very comfortable or easy way to say is, it's not about me, let me blame somebody else. And China looks like a good candidate for Americans to blame.
Allison's Thucydides trap theory has reshaped our understanding of great power rivalries, while also sparking controversy.
Now, there's some things the Taiwanese cannot do and will not be permitted to do, should not be permitted to do, and the U.S. and China should talk about those to be sure they're all, clear what those are.
For many Chinese people, the frustration is they feel like their goodwill has not been well received by Americans. And we look at the South China Sea, we look at Taiwan, we feel like U.S. has been provoking the Philippines and to intrude China's territorial waters. And how do you think China should respond in face of the U.S. aggression?
Well, that's a good question. Let's start with Taiwan, which is the most delicate question. When my old professor, Henry Kissinger, came to China 50 years ago plus to meet with Zhou Enlai, the most important question for the Chinese in reestablishing relations was Taiwan. The most important question at the time for the U.S. was the Soviet Union with the Cold War plus Vietnam. In this conversation, they became to understand that the U.S. and China had irreconcilable differences in views. So you had one view, I had another view. So you could conclude from that, well, okay, if we can't resolve the differences, we should fight about it. They thought that was not the right answer. How about we find a way to manage a situation, even though we don't know exactly what the solution will turn out to be. So how did that work out? So-called strategic ambiguity. In 50 years, people on both sides of the straits have seen more improvement in their well-being than in any 50 years in their whole history. How's that working? I would say pretty well. Now, is it dangerous? Yes. And is it getting more complicated? Yes. And are there occasionally impulses from Taiwan? I mean, certainly if you take the new president, he says Taiwan is already an independent state, in his view. I think that's delusional. So U.S. is clear, there's one China. Taiwan is part of China. And there's no separate Taiwan. There's no independent country Taiwan. Now, there's some things the Taiwanese cannot do and will not be permitted to do, should not be permitted to do. And the U.S. and China should talk about those to be sure they're all, clear what those are. South China Sea and the shoals and islands is more complicated. There's competing claims among many parties, not just China and the Philippines or China, but Vietnam, each have claims against each other. I understand that historically, governments and populations have, there's a kind of a compelling claim about territory. And so if you can claim that something is your territory, it seems like, okay, this is really something that really matters. I find it puzzling, why does it matter very much, most of these little shoals and stuff. So I would think that maybe some more creative diplomacy could find some way to say, okay, what is it that anybody cares about doing there? So they care about commercial shipping passing through there for sending oil to China or goods to Europe or to the U.S. So can everybody agree that that should be uninterrupted? Yes. People want to fish. So, okay, can you work it out so that you can fish and I can fish? Or if there's any oil or something, can we work it out that we can do this jointly? Or I think, again, if I look over the territorial disputes around the world, there's been thousands in history. And sometimes people want to fight about them, but most often they find ways to, manage the differences. I think more creative diplomacy, both by China and by other people in the region, maybe should find some way to resolve this. But again, I haven't looked at it in great detail.
You made a very good metaphor about Samsung and Apple, but can this relation apply to China-US relations? In somehow we see it's quite ideal because China-US can be competition, but it forward to a wrong side, more rhetoric exchange, more people think the other side is enemy, not friend. But can this relationship apply to China-US relations?
So one of the questions is how, obviously, that I've been pursuing, how to escape Thucydides' trap. And my answer is let's search every part of history that we can and every part of other experience in life to see whether we can find any analogies or possible lessons. And I think in particular, searching Chinese history, because it's so long and complicated, and Chinese philosophy, because in many ways it's more nuanced than Western traditions. So in Western tradition, you have an essential logic of non-contradiction. So it's either this or that. And Western tradition, things are more often either or, black, white, friend, foe. Okay? In Chinese tradition, actually the language is much more complicated with more nuances. Well, that's interesting. So can we learn anything from that? In Chinese history, you have the Sung and the Liao. So here is a northern Manchurian tribe. The Sung dynasty can't defeat it. They negotiate a treaty. The Chanyan Treaty, which is about 1,000 years ago. They agreed to be rivalry partners. So some areas they're fierce rivals, other areas they're partners. It's kind of strange, peculiar. How can this work? And this produced a peace that only lasted for 120 years. That's pretty good. And in the business world, I think Apple and Samsung but they're not the only example. If you look, Chinese companies will often be jointly investors in a new development area. So Baidu and Tencent will together invest in your company. I'll do a new one. And I'm wanting the advantages for me, and you're wanting the advantages for you. So life consists of many situations in which there's fiercely rivalrous, in which I really do want to win all the gold medals in the Olympics, and you really do want to win all of the medals, and we compete as hard as we can.
It's interesting you refer to Chinese history to escape the Thucydides trap, and I wonder how this kind of thinking has been received by American audience, as you have.
Some American audiences says, well, if it's a Chinese idea, it must be a bad idea. Okay, I don't like and I say, well, we should draw from all of history of mankind. I mean, I mainly am familiar with Western history. In Western history, we have examples of this as well. So a example that I actually discussed in the book is the Cold War. We really are struggling on every front, on every whatever, but not with a hot war. Well, that's interesting. Now, why not a hot war? Well, because we discovered that if we had a hot war, at the end of it, I would have successfully, if I was successful and achieved all my objectives, I would have completely destroyed you. But unfortunately, in the course of it, you would have completely destroyed me. So for what purpose could I possibly do something that ends up destroying myself? That'd be suicidal. And so unless I'm suicidal, I cannot have a war with you. Well, that's pretty interesting. And both the US and China now today have nuclear arsenals that are essentially equivalent to what we had between the US and the Soviet Union. So I'm an old Cold Warrior. So I have to find some way to be your rival, but not with a war. So one possible vision for future of U.S.-China relations, maybe we have a fierce competition for the next 10, 20, 30, 50 years, and we have a continuous, candid conversation to make sure we don't have misunderstanding. We have serious cooperation in many areas, especially where cooperation is essential for our survival. You know, in history, again, one of the things history teaches is there's no final solutions. History goes on. And mostly, if you ask people to imagine what's going to happen in 50 years, nobody knows.
According to your assessment, the China and US are still following the historical book of the Thucydides trap, but the war might take different forms.
Well, in my conception, the U.S. and China are inevitable Thucydidean rivals. That is, as long as China is intent upon becoming everything it can be, and who as a Chinese would like to do worse than that? So why shouldn't every Chinese aspire for China to be everything China could be? And it seems to me natural. So as long as that's happening, and as long as the U.S. is determined to be the predominant power, this is going to be a rivalry between two states that have different conceptions of themselves. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, I think they can be partners, like the Sung and the Liao, in understanding that, but we can't have a war. And similarly, actually, we can't have unconstrained greenhouse gas emissions. We live in a small biosphere on a small planet. None of us can get off of it. Oh, we have to find a way to constrain. Actually, that's what we're doing. That's part of what the Green Revolution is about. So can we do that? I think we can.
What's driving the current dynamics of the China-US relations? Was it fear, was it honor, or greed?
Okay, you've been reading your Thucydides. What's driving it, I say 75%, is the structural reality of a Thucydidean rivalry. So if you go back and look at my book, this is what it says, and this is what I believe. China is a rapidly rising power and will continue to be. The U.S. is a colossal ruling power and will continue to be. The Chinese believe that it is their right and their destiny to rise, they would insist restore, simply to be allowed to be back whatever we've been for all of history, except for when Westerners showed up here to imperialize us and humiliate us. And U.S. believes that the international order, including the Asian order, that it created in the aftermath of World War II, is the main reason why there have been 78 years without a great power war since World War II. And there's been a stability and security in the Asian setting that has enabled every state that wanted to develop in ways that it could. Now, there have been a couple of detours and problems. So there was the Korean War, there was Vietnam, that was a big mistake. But overall, if you look at the last 1,000 or 4,000 years of history, this is an amazing situation. And the U.S. thinks this is good for everybody, and it should be sustained. So from a Chinese perspective, the idea that the U.S. Navy should be a predominant power in the South China Sea or the East China Sea seems anomalous. Or why is it here? And I would understand if I'm looking at it from Beijing, that seems plausible. From an American point of view, the U.S. alliance with Japan, with South Korea, with the Philippines, with Australia, has provided this stable environment that's been good for everybody. So actually, we think people should say thank you for this, okay? So it's not about to walk away from this. So the structure is the primary thing that's driving. And then in that situation, again, as Thucydides described brilliantly, and I describe in the book with some more detail, in the ruling power, there emerges a fear because the seesaw is moving. So you're sitting on a seesaw with me, okay? And here you are with your feet on the ground. And I'm sitting up here. And when you don't like something I do, you just jiggle the seesaw and, I'm feeling insecure. Now, all of a sudden, the seesaw starts moving. And now you're feeling maybe my feet are not quite, soon my feet are not going to be on the ground. Maybe I only have one foot on the ground. And you can jiggle the thing a little bit. I'm thinking, oh, that's not very comfortable, okay, with the answers. And then you become fearful. Maybe the reason why he's moving the seesaw is because he wants to be sitting on the ground and have a chance to tell me what to do. That's very fearful. And in addition, there are many other factors. I mean, we're living in a period in which inside every nation, the rapid advances of technologies and the connectivity by people all around the world is disrupting people's lives at an increasingly rapid pace. So that means everybody feels a degree of disorientation and insecurity. And in that situation, a very comfortable or easy way to say is, let me blame, it's not about me, let me blame somebody else. And China looks like a good candidate for Americans to blame.
We got many anti-China sentiments right now in
Yes.
Washington. And what about the different camps beneath the surface?
So if you want to then look to see what a Trump presidency might look like in the economic sphere and trade, there are not many things Republicans and Democrats both agree on, but one of them is that China is bad. Okay, so China has emerged as an adversary, even enemy. And again, you said why? The main reason is this seesaw has been moving, not so much even things China has done, but just the fact that, hey, I used to have my feet on the ground and it's easy to blame China. I mean, of course it's uncomfortable and you don't like the fact that American politicians are saying nasty things about China. And I wouldn't if I were Chinese, but you should notice that this is part of a theater. So this is not like real, this is theatrical. They proposed that early on, they would impose 60% sanctions on Chinese imports, but with the objective of having the elimination of the deficit in trade with China and with everybody else. Now, how well that's going to work out, that's a long, complicated thing, I would say. It'll be highly disruptive.
We also discussed his meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping in early 2024.
不是有问到吗？中美你中有我，我中有你是怎么回事儿？就是通过交流嘛，交流合作，最后交融，那不就你中有我，我中有你了吗？思想上也是一样，不同分歧永远会存在，因为他人和人是不一样的，一家人他也是不一样的。
So I said I was very interested in the comment that he had made to the visiting senators in October, Senator Schumer and his delegation, when explaining how we can escape Thucydides' trap. He was talking. He said, look, you have to understand, I am in you and you are in me. Okay? That's a Chinese idiom, but not an American idiom, not Western. So senators had no idea what he's talking about. When they returned home to U.S., two of them called me. There's a long history in China of this expression. What it means, again, it's various versions, but that what sometimes would be called interdependence in the U.S. or members of the same family, but it even can be thicker than that or thinner. In any case, it's an interesting idea if you're trying to ask why the U.S. and China must find some way to coexist rather than have a war in which they would co-destruct. And then he went to several other members. So Steve Schwarzman gave a comment on what's happening at Schwarzman College and the need for continuing educational exchange. And Xi Jinping said, yes, here's his thoughts about this, as he had said in San Francisco. He's hoping there'll be 50,000 Americans, coming to China to study. There's still, I think, about 300,000 Chinese coming U.S., and which is great, but there's only like 3,000 Americans. So that's, post-COVID took a big hit. So the main point was that in conversation, he's very comfortable with the conversation. He understands, what he's talking about, and it's much more convincing, more interesting than when somebody sits there and reads a speech. Yeah.
The conversation is conducted without script, not person.
Oh no, there was no papers, no talking points, no, just like you and me talking. Yeah.
Like you said, when Xi Jinping talked to Schumer, you and me analogy,
Yeah.
Schumer cannot understand what he's talking. But this quite make people think, how can Chinese, from top leader to the people, ordinary people, how can we give the message to the Americans because they cannot understand our language? It's not only about language.
Need to be more extended conversations to say. So I think the idea of that's why people to people and conversation to conversation and having more Americans really have an appreciation of Mandarin and China and Chinese history, have more Americans studying here, as she said. So basically promoting understanding between Americans and Chinese so that the things about which we really disagree, we should be clear. But 80% of the things are things which we don't really disagree. But I am in you and you are in me. If you said, well, we are intertwined and interdependent because we both live in the same enclosed biosphere. When I first heard the idea, I thought it sounded, it's a strange metaphor. It's an interesting version. We can learn from each other.